She had everything. And I mean everything. The kind of everything that most people only ever see in magazines they flip through in waiting rooms and quietly ache over before setting back down on the table. She had the empire. She had the penthouse on the 54th floor of a building that bore her name in steel letters 20 feet tall. She had the cars. She had the staff. She had the charity galas and the magazine covers, and the firm handshake that made senators straighten up in their chairs. She had a husband who was handsome and accomplished and stood beside her at every event, with his jaw set and his suit pressed, and his smile trained precisely on whatever camera happened to be pointing in their direction. By every single measure that the world uses to decide whether or not a woman has won, Victoria Harrington-Wells had won. And she knew, from the very first kiss, that none of it was real. That is where this story begins. Not with a divorce, not with a scandal, not with lawyers or headlines or a courtroom. It begins with a kiss, a wedding kiss. One single moment in front of 412 people, underneath crystal chandeliers in a ballroom in Charleston, South Carolina, on a Saturday evening in late October. The moment her new husband turned to her, lifted her veil, looked into her eyes, and kissed her with the careful, practiced tenderness of a man who was thinking of someone else. And she felt it. She felt the distance in it, the way you feel a draft through a window you thought was sealed. Not with her mind, with something older than her mind, with the part of a woman that knows long before she is ready to admit what she knows. She smiled for the cameras anyway, because that is what Victoria Harrington-Wells had always done. She had built a $4.7 billion real estate empire on the back of that exact talent. The talent of knowing precisely what was falling apart, and smiling anyway, and moving forward, and winning. But this time, the thing that was falling apart was her own heart. And no amount of strategy was going to fix that. Now, before we go any further, I need you to understand something about this story. This is not a simple story. There is no clean villain here. There is no moment where you can point at one person and say, "There, that is the bad one. That is the one who ruined everything." What happened between Victoria Harrington-Wells, her husband Caleb, and the woman he had loved before her, a schoolteacher from Memphis named Renee Carter, is far more complicated than good and evil. It is a story about three people who each made choices they thought were survivable. And what happened when all three of those choices collided inside a single life that was never big enough to contain all of them? There are three questions at the center of this story. Three questions that I am going to spend the next 2 hours answering for you. Completely, honestly, and without flinching. The first question is this: who was Renee Carter, and why did Caleb Wells choose Victoria over her in the first place? Even fully knowing, that he loved Renee and not Victoria. The second question is this: if Victoria knew from the very beginning that her husband's heart belonged to someone else, why did she go through with the marriage at all? What was she actually trying to build? And the third question, the one that is going to haunt you after this video ends, is what happened on the night of their 20th wedding anniversary, when all three of them ended up in the same room, and Victoria Harrington-Wells finally said out loud the things she had been holding in silence for 2 decades. That night changed all three of their lives permanently. And it did not end the way any of them expected. It did not end the way you are expecting either. Before we go any deeper into this story, we would love to know where in the world you are watching from. Drop your city or state in the comments right now. We read every single one. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming stories. Because what is coming next on this channel is going to stop you in your tracks. To understand Victoria Harrington-Wells, you have to go back to Peoria, Illinois, in the year 1971. That is where she was born. Victoria Ann Harrington, third daughter of Gerald Harrington, a man who worked the overnight shift at a Caterpillar assembly plant for 31 years, and Dorothy Harrington, a woman who cleaned houses 5 days a week and sang in the church choir on Sundays, with a voice so beautiful, it made the older women in the congregation close their eyes. The Harrington family was not poor in the way that makes the news. They were poor in the quiet, ordinary, relentless American way. The way where there is always enough food, but never quite enough of anything else. Enough warmth, but not enough heat in the winter. Enough love, but not enough space for it. Enough dreams, but never quite enough runway to get them off the ground. Victoria was different from her two older sisters from the very beginning. Her sisters, Louise and Patricia, were warm girls who laughed easily and fell in love young, and seemed to find comfort in the ordinary rhythms of their small-town lives. Victoria was the one who sat at the kitchen table after dinner with a legal pad and made lists. Lists of things she wanted, lists of plans, lists of everything she was going to do differently when she was old enough to do it herself. Her mother used to watch her from across the room with an expression that was equal parts pride and worry, the way a parent looks at a child who is clearly headed somewhere extraordinary and clearly going to pay a price for it that you cannot fully name yet. She left Peoria at 18 on a full academic scholarship to Northwestern University, where she studied business and finance with a ferocity that her professors still remembered decades later. She graduated at the top of her class. She turned down 3 corporate offers and instead took a position at a small real estate development firm in Chicago, a firm run by a 70-year-old man named Howard Kessler, who had been in the business since before zoning laws existed in half of the Midwest, and who recognized within the first 3 weeks of knowing Victoria that she was going to be either the greatest thing that ever happened to his firm or the thing that eventually ate it. He was right on both counts. By the time Victoria was 29, she had left Kessler's firm, taken 3 investors she had carefully cultivated over 4 years, and launched Harrington Property Group. By 34, the firm was valued at over $200 million, and she was being profiled in business magazines under headlines like "The Iron Lady of Illinois" and "The Woman Who Never Loses." She was efficient. She was precise. She was extraordinarily good at reading people, at understanding what they wanted, what they feared, what they needed to hear in order to make the decisions she needed them to make. These were the skills that built her empire. These were also the skills that would eventually trap her inside a marriage that was beautiful in every way that a marriage can be beautiful on the outside, and hollow in every way that matters on the inside. The one thing the magazines never wrote about, the one thing that never made it into a profile, or a cover story, or a conference keynote, was the question of what Victoria Harrington wanted in her private life. Not her professional life, her private one. The part that existed after the meetings ended and the staff went home and she was alone in whatever city she happened to be in that week, in whatever hotel room or penthouse or rented apartment, with just herself and the silence. The truth, which she did not speak out loud to anyone for the better part of her adult life, was that Victoria Harrington was terrified of love. Not in the girlish, flustered way, in the deep, structural way. The way that comes from watching your mother pour every ounce of herself into loving a man who was good but tired, and who slowly, gradually, stopped seeing her as a woman and started seeing her as a function. She had watched her mother disappear inside her marriage the way water disappears into sand, completely, irreversibly, without drama. And she had decided at a very young age that she would never let that happen to her. So when love came, and it did come, twice, in her 20s, she kept it at arm's length. She dated carefully. She chose men who were busy enough not to need too much from her. She kept her private life as organized and controlled as her professional one. And for years, this worked. For years, she told herself it was enough. And then she met Caleb Wells. And everything she thought she had figured out about herself turned out to be only partially true. Caleb Daniel Wells grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, the only child of a high school football coach named Robert Wells and a pediatric nurse named Sandra Wells, and if you had known him at 24, you would have had no trouble at all understanding why 2 very different women fell completely and deeply in love with him. He was the kind of man who made you feel, when he was talking to you, like you were the only person in the room. Not because he was performing it, because he genuinely meant it, in that moment, completely. He had that rare quality, the quality that the best teachers and the best doctors and the best storytellers share, of being fully, undividedly present. When Caleb Wells gave you his attention, you felt it in your chest. You felt seen. And for a woman who had spent her whole life making herself invisible in order to protect herself, feeling seen by Caleb Wells was an experience that could rearrange the architecture of your entire emotional interior. He had studied architecture at Vanderbilt, actual architecture, the kind where you design buildings. But what he really wanted to do was design spaces for communities that didn't have them. Public libraries, community centers, schools in neighborhoods where the buildings had been neglected so long they had begun to look like apologies. He had big, warm, slightly impractical dreams, and he talked about them with such specific enthusiasm. The way the light would fall through a particular window at a particular angle, the way a reading room should feel like a held breath, that you couldn't help believing he was going to make every single one of them real. He was 25 years old, and he had $30,000 in student loan debt and a one-bedroom apartment in East Nashville that he shared with a roommate named Derek, and he was the happiest he would ever be in his entire life. Because he had Renee Carter. Renee Carter was 24 when she met Caleb at a mutual friend's housewarming party in the spring of 2001. She was a second-year teacher at a public elementary school in Memphis. She had moved back to Tennessee after college to be close to her mother, who had just been diagnosed with lupus and needed help. And she drove up to Nashville on weekends, in a car that she described to friends as being held together primarily by hope and Scotch tape. And she and Caleb fell into each other with the kind of ease that makes people on the outside ache a little to watch. They moved in together after 6 months. They talked about the future constantly, in the specific, detailed way that people only talk about the future when they are absolutely certain the other person is going to be in it. Caleb was going to design buildings that mattered. Renee was going to run a school program for kids who were falling behind. They were going to have a life that meant something. They were going to do it together. That was the plan. What happened instead was that Caleb's firm folded. It was 2008. The financial crisis hit the architecture and construction industry with particular brutality, and the small Nashville firm where Caleb had been working for 3 years, the one that had given him his first real shot at projects he actually believed in, closed its doors in April of that year. He was laid off on a Thursday. He drove home and sat in the parking lot of their apartment complex for 45 minutes before he could bring himself to go inside. He was 32 years old, and he had a 5-year-old car, and a fiancée he had not yet been able to buy a proper ring for, and a dream that had just been handed back to him in a cardboard box, along with his desk plant and 2 architecture reference books. He found freelance work. He took jobs he didn't love, commercial renovations, corporate interiors, the kind of work that pays the bills and slowly drains the exact part of you that went into your chosen field because you loved it. Renee was his anchor through all of it. She was steady and warm and practical in all the ways he was not, and she told him, regularly and without fanfare, that this was temporary, and that the person she had fallen in love with was not defined by what his employer's ledger said. She believed that. She meant it completely. But Caleb had begun, quietly, to believe something different about himself. He had begun to wonder if the version of his life that he had been planning, the idealistic version, the version with the community centers and the meaningful work, and the love that was enough on its own, was a version that was only available to people who could afford to believe in it. And he was no longer sure he was one of those people. That is the headspace Caleb Wells was in on the November afternoon in 2009, when he arrived to oversee a catering setup at a conference room in a downtown Chicago office tower, and found himself standing across a table from Victoria Harrington. She was 41. He was 33. She was in the middle of closing a $230 million acquisition, and she had taken a 15-minute break to get coffee, and when she walked into the room where Caleb was arranging chairs, she stopped. Not because he was handsome, though he was. She stopped because he was the only person she had encountered in 3 days of high-stakes negotiations who looked like he was not performing anything. He was just arranging chairs, quietly, with his full attention. And something about that, something about the simplicity and the completeness of it, reached directly through every layer of armor she had spent 30 years building, and touched something she had not allowed to be touched in a very long time. She asked for his name. He told her. She smiled the way people smile when they have just made a decision they know they will not reverse. Victoria Harrington did not pursue Caleb Wells the way most people pursue the things they want. She did not call him the next day. She did not send flowers or reach out through intermediaries or make herself available at events where she knew he might be. What she did was more deliberate than that, and more patient, and in many ways more devastating in its effectiveness. She researched him, the way she researched everything, thoroughly, quietly, completely. She found out where he had studied. She found out the name of his firm that had closed. She read his thesis on community-driven architecture design from his graduate program at Vanderbilt. She found a project he had designed early in his career, a small community center proposal that had never been built due to funding, and she had her team pull the original drawings. And then, 3 weeks after their first meeting, she called him. She called to ask if he would be willing to consult on a project, not a glamorous project, a community project, a new mixed-income housing development her firm was planning in the south side of Chicago that she had decided, she told him, needed a designer who actually believed in what they were building. Was he interested? Caleb was so surprised by the specificity of her knowledge, that she knew his work, that she had sought him out for exactly this, that it took him a moment to answer. He said yes. He told himself it was professional. He told Renee about it that evening, and she said it sounded like a wonderful opportunity, and she meant it. Renee always meant what she said. What followed over the next 8 months was one of the most careful, sophisticated courtships in the history of people who would deny, if asked directly, that a courtship was happening at all. Victoria gave Caleb exactly what he had been starving for. Not money, not luxury, though those came, but legitimacy. She took his ideas seriously in rooms full of powerful people. She introduced him to developers and city planners who listened when he spoke, because Victoria had told them to listen. She gave him his first project with a real budget and real scope and real impact, a community library in a Chicago neighborhood that hadn't had one in 11 years. When that library opened, Caleb stood in the reading room on opening day and watched children sit down at tables under the exact quality of light he had designed for exactly this moment, and he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt like himself. He felt like the person he had been before 2008 had taken a piece of him he hadn't gotten back. The question he did not ask himself carefully enough, in those months, was whose gift that feeling actually was. Because it was not simply his talent reasserting itself, it was Victoria's power making space for his talent. It was her resources, and her contacts, and her deliberate, strategic decision to invest in him, in who he was, and who he could become, that had made the library possible. And Caleb, who was brilliant in many ways, was not yet clear-eyed enough about his own emotional state to separate the gratitude from the love. He was grateful to Victoria. He was inspired by her. He was deeply, genuinely drawn to the version of himself that existed in her orbit. He confused all of that for something it was not quite yet. Meanwhile, in Memphis, Renee Carter was noticing something she did not want to name. Caleb was calling less. When they were together, he was present in the body, but somewhere else in the mind, in the way of a person who is carrying something they are not ready to put down in front of you. She asked him about it once, directly, in the particular way that Renee asked things, without accusation, without performance, just the clean, honest question delivered with the steadiness that had always been one of the things he loved most about her. She asked, "Is there something you are not telling me?" And Caleb Wells, who had always been honest with her, who had never in 7 years given her a real reason to doubt him, looked at the woman he loved and said no. And in that moment, he crossed a line he could not uncross. Because it was a lie. Not the spectacular lie of a person who has already made their decision and is hiding it. The quieter, more corrosive lie of a person who has not yet made their decision and is afraid of what it reveals about them that they have not. He was, in the spring of 2010, in love with Renee Carter. Completely, genuinely, in the bone-deep way that 7 years of real intimacy builds in two people who have been honest with each other through real difficulty. And he was also being drawn toward Victoria Harrington with a force that he did not yet understand and could not yet name. And he chose in that moment to say nothing and let both things continue to be true simultaneously, which is one of the most human choices a person can make, and also one of the most unkind ones. The moment of decision came in September of 2010. Caleb had been offered a position, not as a consultant, but as the founding director of a new architecture and design division within Harrington Property Group, a division that would be specifically dedicated to community-driven projects. His own team, his own budget, his name on the door, the kind of position that would have been completely inaccessible to him 2 years earlier, that would have seemed like a fantasy he was not entitled to want. Victoria made the offer over dinner at a restaurant on the 45th floor of a building she owned, overlooking Lake Michigan, and she was very clear, in the careful way that Victoria was always clear, that the offer was professional, that it was based entirely on his talent and her assessment of what he could build, that their personal relationship, whatever it was or was not, had nothing to do with it. Caleb almost believed her. He went back to Memphis that weekend. He sat down with Renee on the small back porch of the house they had been renting together for 2 years, the house with the garden she had planted, and the set of wind chimes he had bought her for her birthday that made the particular sound she loved when the Tennessee wind moved through them. And he told her about the offer. He told her it was a professional decision. A career decision. He told her he was thinking about saying yes. And Renee Carter, who was the most perceptive person he had ever known, and who loved him enough to give him the room to make his own choices, even when she could see the shape of where those choices were going, listened to everything he said, and then asked him one question. She asked, "Do you want to go?" And Caleb said yes, and they both understood, in the silence that followed, that something had ended. Not in a dramatic way, in the quiet, devastating way that real endings usually happen. Not with a door slamming, but with a door left slightly open, and then another, until you turn around, and the house you built together is full of nothing but wind. He took the position. He moved to Chicago. He told himself, and told Renee, that they would figure it out. The distance, the logistics, the new shape of everything. But they both knew. They both knew from the moment he said yes, that they were not figuring anything out. They were ending, and he was letting it end, and he was choosing to let it end without the honesty of naming it, because naming it would have required him to look directly at who he was becoming, and he was not yet ready for that. In the 13 months between Caleb Wells joining Harrington Property Group and Victoria Harrington asking him to marry her, yes, she asked him, not the other way around. This detail matters. Two things happened simultaneously that you need to understand if you are going to understand the full weight of the choice he made. The first thing was that his work became extraordinary. Freed from the financial constraints and the compromises of trying to survive as a freelancer in a depressed market, given real resources and real authority and the backing of one of the most respected development firms in the country, Caleb Wells designed 3 projects in those 13 months that genuinely changed the neighborhoods they were built in. A community recreation center in Englewood, a mixed-use development in Pilsen that included affordable apartments above a library branch and a health clinic, a public plaza in Bronzeville that the Chicago Tribune called, in a review that Caleb read 11 times, a rare example of architecture that understands what a community actually needs rather than what looks impressive in a portfolio. He was, professionally, becoming the person he had always believed he could be. He was making the things he had dreamed of making, and Victoria had made all of it possible. The second thing that happened in those 13 months was that he and Renee Carter stopped talking. Not all at once, not with a final conversation or a formal ending. They stopped talking the way tides stop, slowly, without drama, one call becoming 2 weeks instead of one visit becoming 3 months instead of one text going unanswered for a day, and then 2, and then a week, until neither of them was reaching anymore, and both of them were pretending, to everyone including themselves, that this was a natural fade and not a choice. Renee did not call him and accuse him. She did not send angry messages or show up at his door. She did what strong people do when they understand something painful. She accepted the reality of it, quietly and privately, and began the long and painful work of rebuilding herself around the absence of the things she had planned her future around. She did not know, in those months, whether Caleb's absence was about his career, or about Victoria, or about some combination of the two that he was too cowardly to articulate. She did not ask, because she understood that if she asked, and he told her the truth, she would have to feel it completely, and she was not sure she was ready for the full weight of it. On a Sunday evening in November of 2011, Victoria Harrington made Caleb a roast chicken dinner in the kitchen of her penthouse. This was unusual. She had staff who cooked. She herself almost never cooked. And when Caleb asked about it, she said she had wanted to make something real. They ate at the kitchen island instead of the formal dining table. She had opened a bottle of wine from a vineyard in Oregon that she'd visited once on a business trip and had liked. And at the end of the meal, when the plates were cleared, and the wine was almost gone, and the Chicago skyline was doing the thing it does on clear November nights, blazing, and enormous, and indifferent to everything human happening below it, Victoria Harrington looked at Caleb Wells and said, with the directness that was the most reliable thing about her, "I think we should get married, and I think you should take some time to think about it before you answer." She gave him 2 weeks. She told him she was not asking, because she was in love with him in the irrational, consuming way she had observed in other people and always privately distrusted. She was asking because she believed they were good for each other, because she believed in what he was building and wanted to build it with him, because she was 43 years old and she had spent 2 decades treating her personal life like a department that didn't require her full attention, and she was ready to change that. She told him she was asking him because she trusted him more than she had trusted anyone in a very long time. And she told him one more thing, the most honest thing she said in the entire conversation. She told him that she was not going to ask him whether there was someone else, because she already knew the answer. and she was asking him anyway, because she believed that what they could build together was worth more than whatever he was leaving behind. She said it plainly and without cruelty. And it was the most extraordinary thing anyone had ever said to him. Caleb Wells spent those 2 weeks in a state of internal weather that he has never, in any interview or conversation, fully described to anyone. What we know is that he did not call Renee Carter during those 2 weeks. What we know is that he sat in his office late at night looking at the architectural drawings for a school he was designing for a neighborhood on the far south side of Chicago, a school that was possible only because Victoria had fought for the funding in a way that he could not have fought for it alone, and he asked himself questions that did not have clean answers. What we know is that on the 14th day, he went back to Victoria's penthouse and he said yes. He did not call Renee to tell her. She found out the way people find out things they have been quietly preparing themselves to find out. She saw it, eventually, in a magazine. Victoria Harrington, announcing her engagement. Caleb Wells, identified as the founding director of Harrington Property Group's Community Design Division. The photograph of them together. Caleb's hand on Victoria's back. His smile pointed exactly at the camera. And Renee Carter set the magazine down on the break room table at the elementary school, where she had been teaching for 9 years, and she walked to the women's restroom, and she closed the door, and she cried for approximately 4 minutes. Then she washed her face. Then she went back to her classroom, because she had 27 third graders waiting for her, and they needed her, and she had always understood that being needed was its own kind of answer to grief. The wedding of Victoria Harrington and Caleb Wells took place on the 23rd of October 2012 at the Harrington Grand Hotel in Charleston, South Carolina, a property that Victoria owned and had restored from a historic dereliction in 2007. 412 guests. The governor of South Carolina in attendance, a string quartet that had flown in from Vienna, a dress that had required 4 months and 2 separate couturiers, and that was, by any objective measure, one of the most beautiful wedding dresses worn in the state of South Carolina in the first 2 decades of the 21st century. A reception dinner that was reviewed, later, in a Charleston food publication as a masterwork of Southern hospitality, elevated to something close to art. By every external measurement, it was a perfect wedding. It was the kind of wedding that made guests feel they were witnessing something historic. Victoria Harrington walked down the aisle of the hotel's grand ballroom, converted for the ceremony, its ceilings draped in white silk and 10,000 tiny lights, on the arm of her father, Gerald Harrington, who was by this time in his mid-70s and had been battling heart disease for 3 years, and who walked beside his daughter with the expression of a man who is simultaneously overwhelmed with pride and slightly stunned that the determined little girl who sat at his kitchen table making lists had become this particular version of a human being. She was extraordinary that evening. Everyone in that room felt it. The particular gravity that Victoria Harrington had always carried, now amplified by the dress and the flowers and the light and the 400 pairs of eyes watching her move through the room. She looked like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing and had chosen to do it fully and without reservation. Caleb was at the altar when she arrived, and the guests who were watching him, the ones who were not focused on the bride, noticed something that they would describe later, in private conversations, in different ways. Some of them said he looked nervous. Some of them said he looked overwhelmed. Some of them said he looked the way grooms look when the reality of the moment arrives with full force. But one person, a woman named Judith Mayfield, who had been Victoria's closest friend since their days at Northwestern, and who was standing in the front row as Victoria's maid of honor, said something different. She said, later, in the way that people say things they have been carrying for a long time and are finally ready to put down, he looked like a man who was choosing, not celebrating, choosing. And there is a difference. There is an enormous difference. And she saw it. And she said nothing. Because it was not her wedding. And because she understood, even then, that Victoria had already seen it too. The moment of the kiss was the moment that Victoria would return to, privately, for the next 20 years. The officiant, a judge and longtime family friend named Raymond Alcott, pronounced them married. Caleb reached for Victoria's veil. He lifted it slowly and looked at her face, and for 1 second, one single, suspended second, he looked at her with an expression that was genuine and complicated and sad, in a way that weddings are not supposed to be sad, in a way that told the truth about everything he was carrying into that room with him. And then he kissed her, carefully, warmly, with real tenderness and real intention. The crowd exhaled. The photographer captured the moment. The string quartet began to play, and Victoria felt the distance in it. She felt the love in it, too. She was honest enough with herself to know that Caleb Wells did, in his way, love her. He was not a man performing affection he did not feel. What she felt in the careful precision of that kiss was the truth that she had suspected since the first night they had spent together, and had confirmed, slowly, over the months of their engagement, that she was not the whole story for him. That somewhere, in the architecture of his emotional interior, there was a room that she did not have access to. A room that had a name that was Renee Carter, and she kissed him back, and she smiled for the cameras, and she turned to face their 412 guests with the expression of a woman who has won exactly the thing she set out to win, and she held Caleb's hand, and she moved forward. Because moving forward was the thing she had always been best at, and because she had already, in the private cabinet of her extraordinary mind, begun to make a plan for what came next. The marriage of Victoria and Caleb Wells was, from the outside, one of the great American success story marriages of its generation. They were featured in Architectural Digest 3 times, once for the Charleston penthouse, once for the lake house in Michigan they built together, once for the redesign of the Harrington corporate headquarters that Caleb designed as a personal wedding gift to Victoria, a building that won 2 National Architecture Awards, and that Caleb has said in interviews is the project he is most proud of in his career. They appeared at charity galas and industry conferences and political fundraisers. They were photographed together in the way that powerful couples are photographed, close but not clinging, engaged but not performing. The picture of 2 people who have built something real together and are comfortable in its presence. Inside the house, it was more complicated. Not unhappy in the obvious ways, not filled with cruelty or coldness, or the particular quiet warfare that some marriages settle into when love has gone and neither party can bring themselves to end it. What it was, for the first several years, was careful. They were careful with each other. They had agreed, in the early months of their marriage, on certain terms that were never made explicit, but were understood completely by both of them. The way all the most important agreements in a marriage are made. Not in conversation, but in the space between conversations. The agreement was, essentially, this. They would build something extraordinary together, professionally and personally. They would be honest with each other about the things that mattered operationally: money, family, business, decisions. They would not press on the things that were not operational. They would not, specifically, ask too many questions about the interior lives of the other person. They would be partners in the full and serious sense, and they would not confuse that with requiring each other to be everything. For Caleb, this agreement was sustainable because his work was, genuinely, fulfilling in a way that he had not expected it to be at this volume and this scale. In the decade following their marriage, he built 15 significant projects under the Harrington Property Group Community Design Division: schools, libraries, community centers, affordable housing developments, public spaces, that genuinely transformed the neighborhoods they were built in. He was recognized by the American Institute of Architects. He was invited to lecture at graduate schools. He was the person in the room who had actually built things that mattered, and the room knew it, and he knew the room knew it. This was not nothing. This was in fact a great deal. He loved his children. They had 2, a daughter named Elise and a son named Marcus, with a fierceness and a presence that surprised people who expected a man as professionally driven as he was to be a half-present father. He was not half-present. He was there, consistently, in the specific and particular way of a man who understands that his children are real, and their needs are real, and that no professional achievement compensates for failing them. But there was a drawer in his desk at home, a locked drawer, which Victoria had seen but had never opened, that contained a small collection of items. A photograph of a library opening in Nashville from 2001, where a 25-year-old version of him was standing next to a 24-year-old woman with a warm face and a wide smile, and a gap between her 2 front teeth that she had always been self-conscious about. A postcard from Memphis, no signature, just a postcard, a photograph of a Tennessee river at dawn, and a USB drive that contained architectural drawings. Not drawings for any Harrington project, drawings for a school in Memphis. Designed with a specificity and a warmth that was different from anything Caleb had built under the Harrington banner. Designed for a neighborhood that he knew because he had lived near it, with someone he had loved before he understood what love was going to cost him. He had never built that school, but he had kept the drawings. For 20 years, he had kept the drawings. Victoria knew about the drawer. She is the kind of person who always knows. She had known about the drawer since the second year of their marriage, when she had come across the key while organizing Caleb's home office during a renovation. She had held the key in her hand for approximately 40 seconds. Then she had set it back exactly where she found it, and walked out of the room and gone to her own office and spent the next 4 hours on a conference call about a land acquisition in Atlanta. Because that was what Victoria did. She absorbed the information, filed it in the appropriate internal location, and continued moving forward. The drawer was, to her, confirmation of something she had always known, rather than revelation of something she hadn't. It did not surprise her. It did not break her. What it did, what it had been doing, slowly and incrementally, for years, was make her tired. Not of Caleb, not of the marriage, exactly. Of the weight of knowing a thing completely and choosing, every single day, not to speak it. In the 15th year of their marriage, something shifted. It was small at first, so small that Caleb didn't notice it for months. But Victoria had changed the terms of something, quietly, inside herself. And the woman who had spent 15 years being the most strategic person in every room she walked into had begun to ask herself a question she had never allowed herself to ask before. What do I actually want? Because this is a story about 3 people, not 2, I need to tell you what Renee Carter's life looked like during those 20 years. I need to tell you not because she is a secondary character in someone else's story, she is not, but because understanding what Renee became is essential to understanding the ending. And the ending of this story is the reason we are all still here. Renee Carter did not fall apart after Caleb Wells left. She grieved, properly, seriously, in the way that people who are honest with themselves grieve. And then she got up. She had 27 third graders who needed her, and then 24 fourth graders, and then new cohorts every year, and she poured into them with the full force of a woman who had discovered that love was not a finite resource that depleted when you lost a particular person. It was a capacity, and hers was large. She went back to graduate school in her late 30s and earned a master's degree in educational leadership. She used her thesis research to design a reading intervention program for children in the first 3 grades who were showing early signs of reading difficulty, a program she had developed based on years of classroom observation and that she piloted at her school with results that caught the attention of the Memphis City Schools District Administration. By the time she was 42, Renee Carter's reading program had been adopted in 11 Memphis schools and was being evaluated for expansion to 3 other districts in Tennessee. She had been named Teacher of the Year for Shelby County. She had been offered, and declined, a position at the district level. She turned it down because she wanted to stay in the classroom, where the actual work happened, where the actual children were. She was, professionally, precisely the person she had told Caleb she was going to become. Back on that Nashville back porch, back when they talked about the future, with the confidence of people who assume they are going to do it together. She had become that person alone, and the aloneness of it was both a wound and a pride. She dated. Twice seriously enough that her friends believed it might become permanent. The first was a doctor named Terrence, kind and attentive, who wanted to marry her, and who she eventually told, with great gentleness and complete honesty, that she loved him, but not in the way that was fair to him. The second was a man named Samuel, a civil rights attorney, who understood her in ways that surprised her, and who she was with for 4 years before his work took him to Washington, D.C., and the geography defeated them in the quiet way that geography defeats love when 2 people have decided, each for their own reasons, that the life they have built in their own city is not a thing they can dismantle and reassemble somewhere else. She let him go without bitterness. She had become, over 20 years, someone who was very good at letting go without bitterness. What she had not become was someone who had stopped thinking about Caleb Wells. Not in the romantic, pining way. She was too intelligent and too honest with herself for that, but in the way that a person thinks about the place where a significant detour began. He was the road not taken, which is both a cliché and, for the people actually living it, one of the most precise and unrelenting of all human experiences. She did not talk about him. She did not look him up online, though in the later years, his projects were occasionally in the news in ways that made this difficult to avoid entirely. She had not seen him, had not been in contact with him, had not written him a letter, or sent him a message, or made any effort to re-enter his life in any way since the autumn of 2011, when she had understood that he was gone, and had decided that she was going to rebuild herself on terms that did not require him. And then, in January of 2032, 20 years after Caleb and Victoria's wedding, 19 years after Renee had last spoken to either of them, she received an envelope in the mail. Not an email, an actual envelope, cream-colored, heavy stock. The return address was Harrington Property Group. The handwriting on the envelope was not Caleb's. It was a woman's handwriting, controlled, precise, the kind of handwriting that takes up exactly the space it intends to take up and no more. Inside was a single card. And on the card, in that same controlled handwriting, were 23 words that Renee Carter would read 4 times before she set it down on her kitchen table and sat very still for a long moment. 23 words. I believe we have things to say to each other that have waited long enough. Please come to dinner. Victoria Harrington-Wells. There was a date. There was an address. There was a telephone number to call to confirm. Renee sat at that kitchen table for a very long time, and then she picked up the phone. The dinner was held on a Saturday in late October, the same month, 20 years on, as the wedding. This was not accidental. Nothing Victoria Harrington-Wells did was accidental. The guest list was 30 people. Family, close friends, a handful of professional colleagues who had been part of both their lives for decades. Caleb knew about the dinner, of course. He had helped plan it, in the general sense. He knew the date, the venue, the caterer. What Victoria had not told him was that she had added one name to the guest list that he did not know about. What she had not told him was that she had been making a different kind of plan for the past several months. Not a professional one. The most personal one she had ever made. Renee Carter arrived last. She had driven up from Memphis that morning. She still didn't fly if she could help it, a personal quirk that her friends found endearing, and she had spent the drive trying to prepare herself for something she was not certain she could prepare for. She had dressed carefully, but not dramatically. She was 55 years old, and she looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had lived a real life and paid real attention to it. She had her mother's high cheekbones and her father's stillness, and the particular quality of presence that belongs to people who spend decades around children. A quality of being fully in the room, of noticing things, of not performing. The moment she walked through the door of the Harrington-Wells Lakeshore apartment, the room shifted in the way that rooms shift when something unexpected enters them. Caleb was standing at the bar with his son Marcus when he saw her. Marcus would later describe what happened to his father's face in that moment as the strangest thing he had ever seen. Not recognition exactly, but something below recognition. Something that moved through him before his mind had processed what his eyes were telling it. He went very still. Marcus, who was 20 years old and had no context for what he was witnessing, asked him if he was all right. Caleb said yes. He set down his glass carefully. He stood very straight, and he did not move from where he was standing for the next several minutes. Victoria watched all of this from across the room. She had positioned herself with the deliberateness of a woman who has thought about a particular moment many times and wants to be certain she sees it clearly when it arrives. She watched her husband's face, she watched Renee's face, and Renee's face, to her credit, gave away considerably less. Renee was a schoolteacher. She had 25 years of practice maintaining composure in rooms where composure was not necessarily the thing she was feeling. What Victoria saw on Renee's face was awareness. Clear-eyed, careful, unsurprised awareness. The face of a woman who has made a decision to be here and intends to be fully present for whatever being here requires. The dinner proceeded. Victoria was, as she always was in professional and social settings, a masterful hostess. She moved through the room. She made everyone feel attended to. She steered the conversation with the light-handed skill of someone who has spent 30 years managing how a room full of people feels. Caleb recovered his composure. He and Renee were seated at the same long table. Victoria had seen to that, and they spoke briefly, formally, with the particular courtesy of two people who once knew each other with complete intimacy and are now navigating the vast distance between that intimacy and the present moment. He asked about her work. She told him about the program. He said it sounded remarkable. She said it was. And they both understood that none of the sentences they were speaking to each other were the actual sentences. After the dinner plates were cleared and before the dessert course was brought out, Victoria Harrington-Wells stood up. She picked up her champagne glass. The room quieted in the way that rooms quiet when a person of significant presence and authority indicates that they are about to speak. And Victoria, who who had prepared for this moment with the same completeness and the same clarity with which she prepared for every important moment in her professional life, except that this moment was not professional at all. This moment was the most personal thing she had ever done in front of other people, began to speak. She thanked her guests for being there. She spoke about 20 years of marriage with a specificity that was moving. Specific projects, specific moments, specific things that Caleb had built that she was proud of. She was generous and precise and clearly genuine. People were smiling. People were reaching for their glasses, preparing for the toast, and then Victoria set down her own glass, and the room heard the sound of the crystal touching the table, and something shifted in the quality of her voice. Not the volume, the intention, she said. I have been the person in this marriage who knew the most and said the least. I have been very good at both of those things. I have also, over 20 years, become increasingly aware that knowing the most and saying the least is a kind of power, and that I have used that power, not cruelly, but consistently, in ways that have served my interests more than they have served the truth. And I am 56 years old, and I am tired, not of this marriage, not of this man. I am tired of the weight of the thing I have been carrying quietly for 20 years, and I am choosing, tonight, to set it down. The room was absolutely still. 30 people who had come to a dinner party had suddenly found themselves inside something else entirely, something more serious and more true and more uncomfortable than a dinner party. And none of them were certain how to hold it, so they held very still and they listened. Victoria said, I married Caleb knowing he was in love with someone else. I knew it when I asked him to marry me. I knew it on our wedding day. I have known it every single day of our marriage. I am not saying this to humiliate him, or to punish him, or to make a spectacle of our private life, for the benefit of people who have enough private lives of their own to be getting on with. I am saying it because there is a woman in this room, a woman I invited to this dinner, specifically because I believed she deserved to be here, who has spent 20 years living with a particular kind of uncertainty that I helped create, and I owe her the truth. And Caleb deserves the truth. And I deserve to stop being the person who is performing a version of her own life because she decided, at 43, that she was not the kind of woman who needed to be loved completely. She paused, she looked at Renee Carter directly, and she said, I was wrong about that. It took me 20 years to understand how wrong I was, and I am sorry that the understanding came at the cost of time that cannot be returned to any of us. Then she looked at Caleb, and she said, I have already filed for divorce. The papers were signed 2 weeks ago. I did not tell you because I wanted to tell you here, in front of people who love you, so that you would know that what I am doing is not an act of anger. It is an act of honesty. For the first time in our marriage, I am being entirely honest with you, and with myself, and I would like to end things in the same spirit. She picked up her champagne glass. She said, to 20 years of something real, even when it was incomplete, to the work we did together, which was extraordinary, and which I will be proud of for the rest of my life, and to the truth, which is always, always better than the alternative, even when it costs something. She drank. The room was silent for a very long time. What happened in the minutes and hours following that toast has been described differently by the people who were there. What everyone agrees on is this. Caleb Wells stood up. He walked to Victoria. He did not speak loudly. Those nearest to them said they could not hear what he said. What they could see was that he put his hands on either side of her face, the way a person holds something they understand, finally, to be more fragile than they realized. And they saw Victoria close her eyes. And they saw that she did not cry until after he stepped back. And when she did cry, she cried briefly, cleanly, with the controlled composure of a woman who has had a great deal of practice at deciding how much of her internal life is allowed to be visible. And then she stopped. And she thanked the room for their patience, and she suggested that the dessert course might be a welcome intervention, and several people laughed, because there is always, in the most human moments, the relief of laughter. Renee Carter slipped out of the room during this. She did not make a scene. She did not approach Caleb. She picked up her coat from the coat check, and she walked to the elevator, and she rode it down to the lobby, and she walked out onto the lakefront, in the cold October air, and she stood there for a while, looking at the water. She was 55 years old, and she was standing on the shore of a lake in a city she had never lived in, on the night that the woman who had taken the man she loved had apologized to her, in front of 30 people, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. She expected to feel vindicated, or grieved, or angry, or released. What she felt, standing on the lakefront with the water moving darkly in front of her, was something quieter than all of those things. She felt, she would later tell a close friend, like she was finally done waiting for something she had never admitted she was waiting for. And then she felt, underneath that, something even quieter, the recognition that she was complete, that the 20 years of building herself without him had built something real, something that did not require this night to be meaningful, something that had been meaningful all along. The divorce of Victoria Harrington-Wells and Caleb Wells was finalized 14 months after that dinner, in December of 2033. It was conducted with the same efficiency and mutual respect that had characterized the better parts of their marriage. Victoria retained the firm, as had always been specified in their prenuptial agreement. Caleb retained his architecture division as an independent entity, rebranded, at his request, as Wells Community Design, and continued to operate it with the funding structure they had established together. Their children, Elise and Marcus, were 23 and 20 when the divorce was finalized. Both of them have said, publicly and privately, that while the circumstances of the divorce were complicated, the manner of it, the honesty of it, the lack of destruction, was something they are grateful for. Elise, who is a journalist, wrote an essay about it that was published in a magazine 3 years later. In that essay, she wrote that watching her mother tell the truth in public, at the cost of everything she had built, was the bravest thing she has ever witnessed a person do. Victoria Harrington-Wells, at 58, is still running Harrington Property Group. The firm is now valued at just over $6 billion. She is not remarried. She has spoken in interviews about the experience of her marriage, with a candor that is unusual for a person of her stature, candor that has made her, somewhat unexpectedly, a different kind of public figure than she was before. She gave a commencement address at the University of Chicago 2 years after the divorce, in which she said the following, and I want to read this to you carefully, because it is the most important thing she has ever said publicly. For most of my professional life, I believed that the skills that made me effective in business, the ability to know things clearly, to manage information strategically, to make decisions based on outcomes rather than feelings, were the highest possible expression of human intelligence. I have come to understand, at significant personal cost, that this is not true. The highest possible expression of human intelligence is honesty. Honesty about what you feel, honesty about what you want, honesty about what you are doing and why. Everything else, every strategy, every management technique, every negotiating skill, is just furniture. And you can have the most beautiful furniture in the world and still be living in an empty house. Caleb Wells did not go to Renee Carter. I want to be clear about this, because the narrative logic of this kind of story tends to point in that direction, and reality is under no obligation to follow narrative logic. He did not call her after the dinner. He did not show up in Memphis. He did not write her a letter, or send her a message, or try, after 20 years of absence, to reassert himself in her life, as if the years between them were a gap to be bridged, rather than a history to be respected. What he did was spend the first year after the divorce doing something his daughter described, in that same essay, as learning to be alone with himself. Not lonely, alone, present with his own interior life, in a way that he had not been, she said, for as long as she could remember watching him. He went back to Nashville. He took on a project in the East Nashville neighborhood where he had lived at 25, a community arts center, which he designed and built on a compressed budget with a volunteer team that included, at various points, his son Marcus and his daughter Elise, and several former students from the university where he occasionally lectured. The Art Center opened in 2035. It is, by most accounts, beautiful, specific, human in scale, lit exactly as he intended. Renee Carter is still teaching. She is 57 years old. Her reading program has now been adopted in 43 schools across 4 states. She was recognized last year by the Tennessee Department of Education with a Lifetime Achievement Award, which she accepted at a ceremony in Nashville, where she gave a short speech about the particular joy of watching a child discover that words are a door you can walk through, and that once you know how to open it, nobody can close it for you again. People who were there said she was funny and warm and completely without performance, that she talked to the room the way she talks to her students, with the full, present attention of a person who has never confused being seen with being known, and who understands that the second one is the only one that matters. She has not spoken publicly about the events of the anniversary dinner or about Caleb Wells. She was asked about it, once, by a reporter working on a profile of Victoria Harrington-Wells for a business magazine, and she declined to comment. The reporter noted, in the published article, that she smiled when she declined. The kind of smile, the reporter wrote, that belongs to a person who has made peace with something private and intends to keep it that way. I want to end this story by sitting with you for a moment in what it actually means, because I think we have a habit, when we hear stories like this one, stories about love and choices and the costs of those choices, of looking for the lesson, of asking, who was wrong, who was right, who should we judge, who should we forgive? And I understand the impulse. It is uncomfortable to sit with a story that does not offer clean answers. But I want to ask you to stay in the discomfort for a moment, because the discomfort is where the truth lives. Victoria Harrington-Wells spent 20 years choosing power over vulnerability. She chose it consciously, deliberately, and with full knowledge of what she was choosing. And she built extraordinary things in those 20 years. Real things, beautiful things, things that exist in the world and matter to people, and will continue to matter after she is gone. She also spent 20 years carrying the weight of a truth she would not speak, and that weight cost her something she did not know she needed until it was already spent. She was not a villain. She was a person who was very good at some things, and very poor at one particular, crucial thing, allowing herself to be completely honest about what she needed from love. Caleb Wells made a choice at 34 that was human in its weakness and costly in its consequences. He chose a life over a love, and then spent 20 years trying to build a love inside that life, and half succeeding and building remarkable things in the process, and never quite being able to close the drawer in his desk. He was not a monster. He was a person who was afraid of being ordinary, and who reached for the thing that seemed most likely to guarantee he would not be, and who paid for that choice in the particular, daily currency of knowing something was missing, and being too committed to the life he had built to name the thing. He built a school for the community center in Nashville. He built it 23 years after he originally drew the plans. He built it without Renee Carter, and without Harrington money, and without any audience but the neighborhood it was for. That matters. It does not undo the choices he made at 34, but it matters. And Renee Carter did what the least celebrated people in love stories always do. She survived it. She rebuilt herself without drama or announcement, in the way that women often do the most important work of their lives, without anyone watching, without anyone calling it extraordinary, without a magazine cover or a keynote speech. She built a program that has changed how 43 schools teach reading to children who might otherwise fall behind and never catch up. She became the person she intended to become, without the person she thought she was going to become it with. And she showed up to that dinner, because a woman she had never met asked her to. And she was honest enough and brave enough to come and sit in a room full of strangers and be a witness to the truth being told about her own life. And then she walked out the door and stood by the water and felt, not triumph, but completion. There is a difference. Triumph is about winning something. Completion is about becoming whole. I think that is the thing this story is really about. Not betrayal exactly. Not wealth, not power, not the particular cruelty of being loved secondarily when you deserve to be loved first. It is about completion. It is about what it takes, and how long it takes, and what it costs, and what you have to let go of, to become the complete version of yourself. Victoria became it by finally telling the truth. Caleb became it by finally returning to what he had always believed architecture was for, without the safety net of someone else's resources underneath him. And Renee became it years before either of them, quietly, without announcement, in a classroom in Memphis on a Tuesday morning, with 27 8-year-olds who needed her to be completely there, and she was. I want to ask you something before you go. And I mean this sincerely. I want you to sit with this question, and then come tell me your answer in the comments, because these are the conversations that make this channel what it is. The question is this: have you ever known something true about your own life, and chosen not to say it out loud, because saying it out loud would have cost you something you weren't ready to give up? Victoria knew. She chose silence for 20 years, and she paid for it, and she became something extraordinary anyway, in spite of it and because of it. What is the truth you are carrying quietly? What would it cost you to say it? And is that cost, honestly, as high as the cost of continuing to carry it? I want to know what you think. Drop it in the comments. We read every single one. And before we go, we would love to know where in the world you are watching from right now. Drop your city, your state, your country in the comments below. These stories reach people in places I never expected, and every time I see the range of places you are watching from, it reminds me why we do this. And if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos, because the next story we are telling is going to stop you completely. It involves a woman who discovered, on the morning of what she thought was her happiest day, that the man she had loved for 11 years had been living a second life in a different city, a life with a different name, a different address, and a different family. And what she did about it was something that no one who knows her could have predicted. That story is coming very soon. We will see you then.